The cold no longer hurt like before. It was simply there, clinging to the skin like a second garment no one chose to wear. It didn't come in waves. It didn't begin and end. It was constant, a thin layer between the body and the world, as if the air had been replaced by something heavier. At some point, the skin stopped complaining. The body learned to retain the little warmth it had, not for comfort, but out of stubbornness. Hands would stiffen early, even when there was no wind. Fingers bent slowly, as if obeying an ancient rule. There was an economy of movement in everything. Raising a shoulder required calculation. Straightening the spine seemed too grand a gesture for a place where grand gestures drew attention. Life there hid in small things. A gaze that didn't rise, a breath that made no sound. Even when still, she did not rest. There was no true rest. Her body remained alert, like an animal sleeping with one eye open. The weight of the silence held the walls together, held the floor. It was a full, thick silence that brought no calm. It brought warning. A silence where what was heard was not what existed, but what could happen. She learned to recognize signs that weren't signs. The way a footstep approached, the pause before a key turned, the sound of metal touching metal somewhere in the hallway. Tiny things took on a larger scale. In the dark, her brain filled in the gaps with fear, because fear was more useful than hope. Change was almost always punishment. Routine, however bad it might be, had a kind of logic. Predictable pain was less dangerous than the possibility of something new. Something new demanded attention. It demanded interpretation. And misinterpretation was costly. Therefore, when something deviated from the norm, the body reacted before thought. She had already seen what happened when someone believed that an exception meant improvement. A longer look, a second of relief on their face. It was enough to mark the person as weak, as distracted, as someone who is still waiting. Waiting was a flaw. Waiting was something the place knew how to punish. The cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, all of that was direct. It could be measured. It could be endured. The worst came from what couldn't be measured. The interval between a sound and what it announced. The waiting was a physical thing. A knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. She felt it even before opening her eyes in the morning, as if the whole night had been just a rehearsal for what might come. On days like this, the silence seemed even heavier. It wasn't an absence of noise. It was as if the very air held its breath along with them. The kind of silence in which nothing good usually happens. The kind of silence that made the body ready to shrink, ready to obey, ready to cease to exist. She couldn't remember when she had stopped longing for comfort. Perhaps she hadn't stopped. Perhaps she had simply learned to hide the desire, even from herself. Because longing was dangerous. Longing made one vulnerable. And vulnerable there was the same as visible. The cold persisted. The body persisted. The mind too. But with a simple rule that was worth more than any words. Don't expect anything. Don't expect relief. Don't expect kindness. Don't expect anyone, anywhere, to care. If something changes, be prepared. And that morning, even before any clear sound, even before any order, she already felt that something was out of place. Not because something had happened, but because nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. And that was often the worst part. No one needed to explain how it worked. There was no formal warning, no written rules. Learning came through the body, through daily repetition, through what happened when someone forgot, even for a moment, where they were. The absence of basic things wasn't presented as punishment. It was simply the natural state of things. And over time, it came to seem normal. The body adapted because it had no choice. Adapting wasn't courage, nor strength. It was raw survival. Eating little ceased to be hunger and became a measure. Sleeping poorly ceased to be tiredness and became a permanent state. The cold ceased to be something to be fought and became something to be accepted. Not because it hurt less, but because reacting cost too much energy. There was a silent learning process happening all the time. The body was learning not to ask. The mouth remained closed even when the throat burned. The hands stayed still even when they trembled. The gaze searched for nothing. The search was a gesture of hope, and hope attracted attention. She realized, at some point, that her own body had stopped reacting to certain things. A loud noise no longer made her heart race in the same way. A push didn't cause indignation, just an adjustment of balance. It was as if her sensitivity had been tuned to another frequency, lower, more opaque. Reacting less meant suffering less afterward. Desiring something simple was accompanied by shame. Not the shame someone teaches, but the shame that grows inside, as if the desire were a personal failing. An extra sip of water, a lesser of fabric, a little warmth. Thinking about it seemed like weakness, and weakness, there, was dangerous. She saw it in others too. in the faces that hardened when someone mentioned something that reminded them of comfort, as if the simple act of remembering could provoke punishment. There was an unspoken rule: the less you remember what existed before, the easier it is to get through the present. Over time, the idea of comfort came to carry a threat. Something good never came alone. Something good always came before something worse. That's how routine taught. First an exception, then the correction. First relief, then pain. The body stored this sequence better than any conscious memory. Therefore, whenever anything out of the ordinary, even the slightest thing, arose, the body stiffened. Not out of curiosity, but out of defense. It was better to be suspicious than to be grateful. Better to stiffen than to relax. To relax was to forget where you were. And forgetting there had consequences. Routine didn't need to be cruel every day to work. It just needed to be consistent. It just needed to teach, little by little, that asking was pointless, that reacting didn't help, that expecting something good was always a risk. Thus, without words, without speeches, fear became a habit. And when fear becomes a habit, it ceases to be felt all the time. It begins to reside in the background, guiding every small gesture, in the way you sit, in the way you stand, in the way you breathe when someone approaches. None of this was thought about. It was lived, and the body, obedient, did what it had learned. It remained still. It did not ask. It did not wait, because waiting there had never been safe. The command came short, almost casual. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Just one word spoken in a tone that didn't expect a response. The kind of order that explains nothing because explanation was never part of the process. The sound traveled through space and landed directly on the body, even before reaching thought. She moved instantly, not out of understanding, but by reflex. Her body responded as it had been trained, too quickly to allow for doubt. Questioning required time, and time was something that could not be granted. The gesture came automatically, as if someone had pulled an invisible thread from within her. My heart raced before anything actually happened. There was a familiar tension in that precise moment between listening and acting. A small but weighty interval where everything could go wrong. The order was simple, but simplicity didn't mean safety. Sometimes it was quite the opposite. She felt her muscles tense without realizing it. Shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. Her body braced for impact even without knowing where it would come from. It was always like this. The threat wasn't in the command itself, but in what might come after it. In the possible mistake, in the misinterpretation, in the detail that escaped her notice. No one asked what it meant. To ask was to admit that one didn't know, and not knowing was dangerous. The place had taught that ignorance was no excuse. The body had to know before the mind. It had to anticipate. It had to get it right. She kept her gaze lowered, as she had learned, not to demonstrate conscious submission, but because raising her eyes seemed too grand a gesture. Looking too much could be interpreted as defiance, looking too little as inattention. The balance was delicate, learned through force, adjusted day after day. While he obeyed, the tension didn't lessen. On the contrary, the movement only shifted the fear elsewhere. Now he focused on waiting for the next sound, the next word, the next gesture. His body functioned, but inside everything remained suspended. There was always a feeling that something was about to be revealed, something that didn't yet have a form, but already weighed heavily. The simple command was just the door. What came after was what mattered, and that was never clear. She felt it in the way she breathed, short, controlled, as if any excess could draw attention. She felt it in the exaggerated care with each step, each movement. Nothing could seem too slow. Nothing could seem too fast. Everything needed to seem right, even without knowing what was right. The fear there didn't scream. It didn't need to. It functioned better in silence, infiltrating gestures, guiding decisions without announcing itself. It was a fear that didn't completely paralyze. It moved. It moved quickly. It moved obediently. And while the body followed the order, the mind remained trapped in that question that was never asked aloud. What happens if I make a mistake? The answer never came beforehand. It never came as a warning. She always came later, after the order was given. Nothing happened immediately. And that nothingness began to occupy space. It wasn't rest. It wasn't relief. It was a heavy suspension, as if time had been paused without permission. The body remained where it was, but the mind moved forward, imagining all the possibilities that were not yet taking shape. She learned that the worst really came quickly. Speed was almost a mercy. What truly hurt was the delay, the prolonged wait, where each second seemed like a silent test. The punishment, when it came, at least ended the tension. The wait didn't end anything. It only accumulated. Eyes remained lowered, not out of respect, but out of instinct. The ground was safer than any face. Immobile bodies seemed smaller, less present. The stillness was an attempt to disappear without leaving the place. Breathing became a restrained, measured exercise, as if the sound of air entering and leaving could be interpreted as excess. She felt the weight of her own body resting on her feet, her tired legs, her stiff joints. Every muscle seemed alert, ready to react, but without knowing how. It was a useless, exhausting readiness. A state in which nothing is done, but everything is suffered. The silence was unhelpful. It wasn't empty. It was dense, laden with meaning. A silence that didn't say what was going to happen, but confirmed that something was being decided beyond their reach. The silence there wasn't an absence of action. It was invisible action. She knew this kind of waiting. She had experienced it before. He knew how the body would begin to ache even before any touch. How the throat would dry up without thirst. How the stomach would contract not from hunger, but from anticipation. The body was preparing for something that didn't yet exist. Nobody moved. Not because anyone had ordered them to stay still, but because moving seemed like an unnecessary risk. The slightest gesture could break that fragile balance. Fear had taught them that, while waiting, the best thing to do was not to offer anything that could be used against them. Time passed in a strange way. There was no clock, but she felt every interval. Each second seemed to drag on, too heavy to move forward, too light to end. Her mind tried to distract itself, but always returned to the same point. What comes next? She expected the worst not because she was pessimistic, but because experience had taught her that expecting the worst was safer. If something less cruel came, the impact would be less. If exactly what she feared came, at least her body would already be prepared. The waiting hurt more than many of the punishments she remembered, because while waiting, anything was still possible, including things no one wanted to imagine. Her body didn't know what to defend itself against, and that kept it in a state of constant alert. The silence continued, and in that silence, the expectation solidified into certainty. It's not over yet. It's not over. And that, once again, was the biggest factor. The gesture came unannounced. It wasn't preceded by harsh words or explanations. It simply happened, too small to attract attention at first glance, too common to justify the weight it carried. And yet, nothing about it matched what they knew of that place. For a moment, no one reacted, not because they hadn't seen it, but because the body took time to accept what the eyes were registering. There was a distance between perceiving and understanding, between recognizing the form of the gesture and allowing it to mean something beyond a threat. She felt the confusion spread quickly, like a different internal chill. Acceptance seemed dangerous. Distrust seemed safer. Her body hesitated, trapped between two opposing lessons. The old impulse to protect herself and something new, still unnamed, that was trying to infiltrate. Nothing in her routine had prepared her for this. Common gestures, in other contexts, were always accompanied by hidden intentions. The care, when it existed, was usually false, a means to another end, an interval before something worse. Her body remembered this clearly. Even so, before she could decide, her body reacted. It wasn't a big movement. It was a minimal adjustment, almost imperceptible. A muscle relaxing for a second. A forgotten reflex manifesting itself without asking permission. The mind came afterward, trying to correct it, trying to regain control. She felt the discomfort of this immediate reaction, as if she had made a personal mistake. Allowing any automatic response seemed risky. The place had taught her that feeling too much was a flaw, that reacting to what seemed like care was opening the door to disappointment. The gesture remained there, suspended in the air, unexplained. It demanded nothing. It charged nothing. This made everything even stranger. The absence of demands left the body without reference points, unsure how to position itself, unsure which posture to adopt to protect itself. She realized then how difficult it was to recognize care after so much deprivation. Not because care was complex, but because its prolonged absence had altered something inside. The body no longer remembered how to receive without defending itself, how to accept without calculating the price. There was a different kind of silence at that moment. Not the silence of threat, but a silence of confusion. A silence where no one knew exactly what to do with what was happening. The gesture didn't fit into the logic of war as she knew it. It didn't obey the rules she had learned. It didn't follow the usual sequence of relief and punishment. She remained motionless, feeling the conflict growing inside. Part of her wanted to reject it immediately, shut herself off, return to the familiar state. Another part, smaller, almost invisible, felt something shifting. Something old, forgotten, trying to resurface. Nothing was said, nothing was explained, and perhaps for that very reason, the gesture carried more weight than any words. Because, for the first time in a long time, the danger wasn't clear. And when the danger is unclear, the body no longer knows exactly how to cope. She didn't immediately realize what was happening. First came the sensation, raw, nameless. A simple, direct contact that pierced her skin before any thought could enter. Her body reacted in a way she didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't defense. It wasn't retreat. It was something else, forgotten for too long. There was warmth, not the pervasive warmth of a safe place, but a localized, precise warmth enough to break the uniformity of the constant cold. Her body felt it as a slight shock, almost a mistake, something that shouldn't be there, something that didn't belong in that reality. For a second, she thought she was imagining it. The feeling persisted, and with it came an unexpected fragility, not physical, but internal, as if an old layer had been touched without warning. The body remembered, even if the mind resisted. It remembered what it was like not to always be on alert. It remembered what it was like not to prepare for the pain right after. She felt her chest tighten, not from immediate fear, but from something more confusing. A silent conflict between relief and distrust. Relief at feeling something that didn't hurt. Fear at not knowing what it would cost later. Her body wanted to stay in that moment. Her mind wanted to escape it as quickly as possible. There were no visible tears, no dramatic reaction, just a sudden hardening of her face, as if she needed to contain something that threatened to escape. Any display was dangerous. But inside, something had been displaced, something small but profound. The body's memory awoke without asking permission, not as a clear recollection, but as recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't come through images, but through sensations. A silent reminder that the body knew what care was, even after so much time, even after so much deprivation. She then realized how something so basic could be so disruptive, not through excess, but through contrast. The simplicity of the gesture made everything more fragile. There was no grandeur there. There was no heroism, just something too human for that context. The conflict continued. Part of her wanted to reject that feeling immediately, erase it before it took root. Another part, too tired to fight, allowed it to exist for a few more seconds, not as hope, just as a momentary reality. At that moment, she understood, without putting it into words, that dignity could exist in silence. It didn't need to be announced. It didn't need to be explained. It could emerge like that, discreet, almost invisible, in the midst of a place built to deny all of that. The body remained motionless. The face remained neutral. Nothing changed on the outside, but inside, something had awakened. And once awake, it would be impossible to pretend that he had never been there. Nothing was said afterward. There was no explanation, no continuation, no commentary to give form to what had happened. The moment passed as everything else passed there, without ceremony, without closure. The body was taken back to its routine, to the familiar cold, to the silence that already had a name. But something didn't return to its exact place as before. She realized it gradually, not as a clear thought, but as a different kind of weight inside. It wasn't comfort, nor was it hope. It was something harder to name. A kind of internal displacement, as if her body had been reminded of something that could no longer be forgotten. The consequences didn't appear immediately. There was no visible change the next day. The cold continued. The hunger continued. The fear continued. Everything remained the same on the outside, and yet there was a tiny, almost imperceptible difference that existed only inside her. The simple gesture had opened a small, silent crack. Not enough to save anyone. Not enough to change the logic of that place, but enough to show that that logic was not absolute. That, even there, something human could cross without asking permission. This made everything more complex, because the war had taught us to fear, to harden ourselves, to survive by closing ourselves off. That moment had taught us something else. Not a clear lesson, just an uncomfortable possibility that dignity didn't need a suitable setting to exist. She didn't talk about it. She wouldn't know how. There were no right words. There was only the lingering feeling that something had been preserved, even without promise, even without continuity. Something too small to be celebrated, too big to be ignored. The body remained obedient. The gestures were restrained, the face neutral, but somewhere deep inside, that brief warmth still existed as a physical memory, not as consolation, but as proof. Proof that, despite everything, not everything had been taken away. The ending brought no relief. It brought silence. A silence different from the one at the beginning. No less heavy, just another kind. A silence where nothing would ever be the same again. But something silently resisted. Some people move on. Others stay a little longer. The stories continue here for those who choose to stay.